On a freezing winter night, a wealthy young woman encounters a homeless man and, driven by compassion, decides to take him home to save him from the deadly cold. However, when he steps out of the bath completely transformed, she could never have foreseen the shocking revelation that was about to change her life forever. The frigid Colorado wind howled through the towering pines, their branches heavy with fresh snow. Elizabeth Montgomery stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her downtown Denver penthouse, her reflection ghostly against the city lights below. At 34, she was the epitome of success, CEO of Montgomery Enterprises, heiress to a real estate empire, and one of Forbes's 30 under 40 to watch. Yet as she gazed at the bustling streets, a familiar emptiness gnawed at her core. Elizabeth's manicured fingers traced the cold glass, her mind drifting to the countless board meetings, charity galas, and jet-setting trips that filled her calendar. She had everything money could buy, but the recent loss of her father, Richard Montgomery, had left a void no acquisition could fill. The great man's absence loomed large, his booming laugh and larger-than-life presence now nothing more than echoes in empty hallways. "Ms. Montgomery," her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "The board is waiting for you in the conference room." Elizabeth sighed, smoothing her tailored Armani suit. "I'll be right there, Sarah. Thank you." The meeting dragged on, filled with profit projections and expansion plans. Elizabeth nodded at all the right moments, her mind elsewhere. As the last executive filed out, she slumped in her leather chair, exhaustion seeping into her bones. Sarah appeared in the doorway, concern etched on her face. "Is everything all right, Ms. Montgomery?" Elizabeth managed a weak smile. "Just tired, Sarah. It's been a long week." "It's only Tuesday," Sarah gently reminded her. "Is it?" Elizabeth chuckled humorlessly. "God, I need a break." Sarah hesitated, then said, "Your father's birthday is coming up this weekend. Perhaps you could take some time off. Go up to the mountain house." The suggestion hit Elizabeth like a punch to the gut. The mountain house, her father's sanctuary, now hers. She hadn't been there since the funeral, unable to face the memories. But suddenly, the idea of escaping the city's suffocating grip was overwhelmingly appealing. "You know what, Sarah? That's not a bad idea. Cancel my appointments for the rest of the week. I'm going to head up to Vail." Sarah's eyebrows shot up. "Now? But there's a big storm rolling in." Elizabeth was already grabbing her coat. "I'll be fine. I need this." "Have the house opened up and stocked, will you?" "Of course, Ms. Montgomery. Please drive safely." The highways out of Denver were relatively clear, but as Elizabeth's sleek Audi Q7 climbed into the mountains, the weather took a turn for the worse. Snow pelted the windshield, the wipers struggling to keep up. The radio crackled with warnings of whiteout conditions and closed roads ahead. Elizabeth gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles white. Part of her knew she should turn back, find a hotel for the night, but a stronger, more reckless part pushed her forward. She needed to outrun the ghosts chasing her, even if it meant driving straight into the heart of the storm. As night fell, the world outside became a swirling vortex of white. Elizabeth leaned forward, straining to see the road. Her GPS had long since lost signal, leaving her to navigate by memory and instinct. The familiar landmarks were buried under feet of snow, turning the once familiar route into an alien landscape. A sudden gust of wind rocked the SUV, and Elizabeth felt the tires lose traction. Her heart raced as she fought to regain control, the vehicle fishtailing dangerously close to the guardrail. With a silent prayer, she managed to straighten out, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Get it together, Liz," she muttered to herself. "You can do this." Just as her nerves began to settle, a dark shape loomed in her headlights. Elizabeth slammed on the brakes, the ABS kicking in as the Audi slid to a stop mere inches from a figure huddled by the roadside. For a moment, Elizabeth sat frozen, her hands shaking on the wheel. The figure hadn't moved, and a horrifying thought crossed her mind. Had she hit someone? Swallowing her fear, she grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the howling wind. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath away. Snow immediately began to soak through her designer boots as she trudged towards the hunched form. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Are you all right?" As she drew closer, she saw it was a man, wrapped in what looked like little more than rags. He stirred at the sound of her voice, lifting his head. The beam of her flashlight illuminated a gaunt face, eyes squinting against the sudden brightness. "I'm fine," the man croaked, his voice rough from disuse. "Keep moving." Elizabeth hesitated. Every instinct told her to get back in her car and drive away. This was how horror movies started after all. But something in the man's defeated tone tugged at her heart. "You'll freeze out here," she said, kneeling beside him. "Let me help you. I have a place nearby, warm and safe." The man barked out a harsh laugh. "Lady, nothing's safe, especially not for someone like me with someone like you." Elizabeth flinched at the bitterness in his voice but stood her ground. "I'm Elizabeth, and you are." He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally he muttered, "Jack. Name's Jack." "Well, Jack," Elizabeth said, forcing cheerfulness into her tone, "I'm not leaving you out here to die, so you have two choices. Come with me willingly, or I'll call for help and have you forcibly rescued. Your call." Jack stared at her, bewilderment replacing some of the hostility in his eyes. "You're serious, aren't you?" "As a heart attack," Elizabeth confirmed. "Now can you walk?" With visible effort, Jack pushed himself to his feet. He swayed dangerously, and Elizabeth rushed to support him. Despite the layers of ragged clothing, she could feel how thin he was, his body radiating a concerning heat despite the frigid air. "My car's just there," she said, guiding him through the snow. "Let's get you warmed up." Getting Jack into the passenger seat was a struggle, but eventually Elizabeth had him buckled in and the heat blasting. As she pulled back onto the road, she cast a sidelong glance at her unexpected companion. In the harsh glow of the dashboard lights, Jack looked even worse. His face was gaunt, cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass. A ragged beard couldn't hide the sores on his lips, and his eyes were glassy with what Elizabeth suspected was fever. "There's water in the console," she said softly. "Help yourself." Jack's hand shook as he reached for the bottle, but he managed to take a few small sips. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elizabeth kept her eyes on the treacherous road as she answered, "Because it's the right thing to do, and because I know what it's like to feel alone." The rest of the drive passed in silence, broken only by Jack's labored breathing and the howl of the wind outside. Elizabeth's mind raced, questioning her decision, even as she knew she couldn't have left him behind. Finally, the lights of the Montgomery family's Vale compound came into view. Elizabeth let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. As she pulled up to the main house, she saw Jack's eyes widen in disbelief. "This is your place?" he asked, a hint of his earlier suspicion returning. Elizabeth nodded, suddenly self-conscious of the mansion's grandeur. "It was my father's. Now it's mine, I suppose." She helped Jack out of the car, supporting much of his weight as they made their way to the front door. As they crossed the threshold into the warm, softly lit foyer, Elizabeth felt a strange sense of rightness settle over her. For the first time in months, the emptiness inside her receded, replaced by a sense of purpose. "Let's get you cleaned up," she said, leading Jack towards the guest wing. "Then we'll see about some food and medicine. You're safe now, Jack. I promise." As they disappeared down the hallway, neither noticed the old photograph hanging in the entryway. In it, a young Elizabeth smiled brightly, next to a handsome teenage boy with familiar eyes that now, years later, stared out from Jack's gaunt face. The storm raged on outside, but within the walls of the Montgomery mansion, the winds of change were already beginning to blow. The first rays of dawn crept through the frost-laced windows, casting a warm glow across the plush carpets of the guest room. Jack stirred, his eyes fluttering open in confusion. For a moment he lay motionless, trying to reconcile the soft mattress beneath him with the harsh memories of concrete sidewalks and park benches. Slowly, the events of the previous night came back to him. The blizzard, the fancy car, the woman, Elizabeth. Jack sat up abruptly, his head spinning from the sudden movement. He found himself dressed in clean, soft pajamas that definitely weren't his. The room around him was larger than any apartment he'd ever lived in, decorated in muted earth tones and dotted with expensive-looking artwork. "What the hell?" he muttered, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. His bare feet sank into the thick carpet, and he wiggled his toes, marveling at the simple luxury. A gentle knock at the door made him jump. "Jack?" Elizabeth's voice called softly. "Are you awake? I've brought some breakfast." Jack's stomach growled at the mention of food, but anxiety twisted in his gut. Yeah, come in," he replied, his voice still rough with sleep. Elizabeth entered, balancing a tray laden with more food than Jack had seen in months. The scent of coffee, bacon, and fresh bread made his mouth water. She set the tray on a nearby table, then turned to him with a smile that didn't quite hide the concern in her eyes. "How are you feeling?" she asked, keeping her distance as if afraid of spooking him. Jack ran a hand through his tangled hair, acutely aware of how out of place he must look in this pristine room. "Better, I think. Thank you for all this." He gestured vaguely at the room and the food. Elizabeth's smile warmed. "You're welcome. Why don't you eat something? Then maybe we can talk?" Jack nodded, moving cautiously to the table. He picked up a piece of toast, taking a small bite. It was all he could do not to wolf down the entire plate in seconds. Elizabeth watched him for a moment, then said, "I'll let you eat in peace. There are clean clothes in the dresser. When you're ready, come find me in the living room. Down the hall, take a left." After she left, Jack ate with increasing urgency, savoring flavors he'd almost forgotten. When the plate was clean, he explored the attached bathroom, marveling at the array of toiletries and the rainfall shower. He stood under the hot water for what felt like hours, scrubbing away layers of grime and fatigue. Dressed in jeans and a soft sweater that fit surprisingly well, Jack made his way down the hall. He passed numerous closed doors, each one hinting at more luxury beyond. Family photos lined the walls. Elizabeth, through the years, always smiling, always surrounded by well-dressed people who exuded success and confidence. Jack's steps slowed as he neared the living room, doubt creeping in. What was he doing here? He didn't belong in this world of wealth and privilege. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to get out before he was hurt or humiliated. But then he saw Elizabeth, curled up on a leather sofa with a book, and something tugged at the edges of his memory. There was something achingly familiar about the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the slight furrow of concentration between her brows. "Jack," she said, looking up with a smile. "Come in, please. How are you feeling?" He stepped into the room, trying not to gawk at the vaulted ceilings and the wall of windows overlooking a snow-covered valley. "Better," he admitted. "Thank you again for everything." Elizabeth set her book aside and gestured for him to sit. "I'm glad. I was worried about you last night. You had quite a fever." Jack lowered himself into an armchair, perched on the edge as if ready to bolt at any moment. "Yeah, I don't remember much after getting in your car." A moment of awkward silence stretched between them. Jack fidgeted with the soft fabric of his borrowed sweater, while Elizabeth seemed to be searching for the right words. Finally, she spoke. "Jack, I know this must be very strange for you, and I want you to know that you're under no obligation to stay or to tell me anything about yourself, but I'd like to help if you'll let me." Jack's defenses rose immediately. "Why? You don't know me. I could be dangerous, a criminal." Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. "Are you?" "No," Jack admitted after a pause, "but you couldn't have known that." "I didn't," Elizabeth agreed, "but I knew I couldn't leave you out there to die. The rest, well, I'm choosing to have faith in human decency." Jack snorted. "Not much of that left in the world, in my experience." A shadow passed over Elizabeth's face. "Maybe, but that doesn't mean we stop trying to be better, does it?" Something about her words struck a chord in Jack. A fragment of memory flashed through his mind. A man's voice, warm and encouraging. "It's not about the hand you're dealt, son. It's about how you play it." Jack shook his head, trying to clear the cobwebs of his past. "Look, I appreciate everything you've done, but I can't stay here. I don't belong in all this." He gestured at the opulent room around them. Elizabeth leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Where will you go, Jack? Back to the streets? It's the dead of winter." "I've survived worse," Jack muttered, but even he could hear the lack of conviction in his voice. "I'm sure you have," Elizabeth said softly, "but you shouldn't have to. Not when there's another option." Jack's eyes narrowed. "What option? You gonna fix me up with a job and an apartment? Play fairy godmother to the poor homeless guy?" Elizabeth flinched at his harsh tone but held her ground. "No. I'm offering you a chance to heal, to figure out your next steps without the immediate pressure of survival. Stay here for a while, get healthy, and maybe we can figure out where you came from, who you were before." Jack stood abruptly, pacing the length of the room. "What makes you think I want to remember? Maybe there's a reason I ended up on the streets." Elizabeth watched him, her expression a mix of compassion and something else, a hunger for answers that Jack couldn't quite understand. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Jack, even if they don't believe they do." Jack paused by the windows, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. In the distance he could see other houses, massive, luxurious retreats for the ultra-wealthy. A world he'd never belonged to, even before. Before what? Jack pressed his forehead against the cool glass, frustration building as he tried to grasp at the wisps of his past. There was something there, just out of reach. A life, a family, a purpose. But every time he thought he was close to remembering, the memories slipped away like smoke. "I don't know who I am," he admitted quietly, his breath fogging the window. "I remember waking up in a hospital. They said I'd been in an accident, that I was lucky to be alive, but I couldn't remember anything. My name, my family, nothing." Elizabeth moved to stand beside him, close but not touching. "How long ago was that?" Jack shrugged. 3, maybe 4 years. It's all a blur. I left the hospital as soon as I could. Couldn't pay the bills, couldn't answer their questions. Been on the move ever since." "And you never tried to find out more about your past?" Elizabeth asked gently. Jack turned to her, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "With what resources? I couldn't even feed myself most days. Solving the mystery of my identity wasn't exactly a priority." Elizabeth nodded, her eyes filled with a sadness that made Jack uncomfortable. He didn't want her pity. "I'm sorry," she said. "I can't imagine how difficult that must have been." Jack shrugged again, turning back to the window. "It is what it is. Can't miss what you don't remember, right?" But even as he said it, Jack knew it wasn't true. The ache of loss had been his constant companion, a hollow space inside him that no amount of forgetting could fill. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was hesitant. "Jack, I have resources. Connections. If you wanted to try and find out more about your past, I could help." Jack spun to face her, suspicion flaring. "Why would you do that? What's in it for you?" Elizabeth took a step back, hurt flashing across her face. "Nothing. I know what it's like to feel lost, to question your place in the world. If I can help someone else find their way, isn't that reason enough?" Jack studied her, searching for any sign of deception, but all he saw was sincerity and a deep, almost desperate need to do something meaningful. "You're not happy," he realized aloud. "All this," he waved a hand at the luxurious surroundings, "and you're miserable." Elizabeth's composure cracked, just for a moment. In that instant, Jack saw the weight she carried, the expectations, the loneliness, the grief. Then her mask slipped back into place, and she was once again the poised, confident woman who had rescued him from the storm. "My happiness isn't the issue here," she said firmly. "We're talking about you, Jack, about giving you a chance to reclaim your life." Jack ran a hand through his hair, conflicting emotions warring within him. Part of him yearned to know the truth, to understand the dreams and fragments of memory that haunted him, but another part was terrified of what he might discover. "What if I don't like what I find out?" he asked quietly. "What if I was someone bad?" Elizabeth's expression softened. "Then you'll have the chance to choose who you want to be now. The past doesn't have to define you, Jack." A memory stirred, a woman's voice this time, warm and loving. "You have a good heart, Jake. Never forget that." Jake. The name echoed in Jack's mind, feeling both foreign and achingly familiar. He swayed slightly and Elizabeth reached out to steady him. "Jack, are you all right?" He blinked, focusing on her concerned face. For a split second he saw her younger, a teenager with braces and freckles, laughing as she chased him through a sunlit garden. Jack jerked away from her touch, his heart pounding. I need some air," he muttered, stumbling towards the patio doors. Elizabeth followed him outside, where the crisp mountain air bit at their skin. Jack gripped the railing of the deck, taking deep breaths as he tried to make sense of the images flooding his mind. "Jack," Elizabeth said softly, "whatever you're remembering, whatever you're feeling, you don't have to face it alone. Let me help you." He turned to look at her, really look at her for the first time, and in that moment, something clicked into place. The familiarity, the sense of connection he'd felt since she'd found him on that snowy road. It wasn't just gratitude or confusion. "I know you," Jack whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know how, but I know you." Elizabeth's eyes widened, a mix of hope and fear crossing her face. "What do you mean?" But before Jack could answer, a searing pain lanced through his head. He cried out, clutching his temples as his knees buckled. "Jack!" Elizabeth exclaimed, rushing to catch him as he collapsed. As consciousness slipped away, Jack heard a child's laughter, saw a flash of a red bicycle, felt the warmth of a summer day, and through it all, a name echoed in his mind. Jake. My name is Jake. The world faded to black, leaving Elizabeth cradling Jack's unconscious form on the snow-dusted deck, the mountains looming silently in the distance, holding secrets yet to be revealed. The steady beep of a heart monitor filled the sterile hospital room as Jack slowly regained consciousness. His eyelids fluttered open, squinting against the harsh fluorescent lights. As his vision cleared, he found Elizabeth sitting by his bedside, her face etched with worry and something else, a mix of hope and fear that made his stomach clench. "Jack," she breathed, leaning forward. "How are you feeling?" He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. Elizabeth quickly offered him a cup of water, helping him take small sips. As the cool liquid soothed his parched throat, fragments of memory flashed through his mind. The mountain house, the sudden pain, the flood of images, just before he blacked out. "What happened?" he managed to croak out. Elizabeth's hands twisted in her lap. "You collapsed. The doctors say it was a combination of exhaustion, malnutrition, and..." She hesitated. "And possibly the return of repressed memories." Jack, or was it Jake, closed his eyes, trying to make sense of the jumbled images in his mind. "I remembered something," he said slowly. "A name. Jake. And you. I knew you, didn't I?" Elizabeth's breath caught. "Jack, there's something I need to show you." She reached into her purse and pulled out a worn photograph. With trembling hands, she held it out to him. Jack took it, his brow furrowing as he studied the image. It showed two teenagers, a girl with braces and freckles who was unmistakably a young Elizabeth, and a boy with familiar eyes. His eyes. "That's us," Elizabeth said softly. "At my sweet 16 party. You're my cousin, Jake Montgomery." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Jake, stared at the photograph, a tidal wave of emotions crashing over him. Relief at finally knowing his identity, warred with confusion and a deep, aching sense of loss for the years stolen from him. "How," he started, his voice breaking. "How is this possible? Why didn't you recognize me?" Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "I did, in a way. That's why I couldn't leave you on that road. There was something so familiar about you, but I couldn't place it. Jake, you've been missing for 10 years. We all thought you were dead." The weight of her words settled over him like a heavy blanket. 10 years. A decade of his life, gone in the blink of an eye. Jake closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the flood of memories now rushing back. He saw flashes of a happy childhood, summers at this very mountain house, holiday dinners with a large, boisterous family, Elizabeth always by his side, more like a sister than a cousin. Then came darker memories, arguments with his father, feeling trapped by family expectations, a reckless decision to go sailing alone in a storm. "The accident," Jake murmured, opening his eyes to meet Elizabeth's gaze. "I remember the storm, the boat capsizing. I must have hit my head." Elizabeth nodded, wiping away her tears. "The Coast Guard searched for weeks. They found pieces of the boat, but never you. Eventually they declared you dead." Jake let out a shaky breath, trying to reconcile the life he'd forgotten with the harsh reality of his years on the streets. "And now? What happens now?" Before Elizabeth could answer, a commotion in the hallway drew their attention. The door burst open, and an older woman rushed in, her eyes wild with a desperate hope. "Jake!" she gasped, freezing at the sight of him. "Oh my God, it's really you!" Recognition hit Jake like a physical blow. "Mom!" he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. Margaret Montgomery let out a strangled sob and rushed to her son's bedside, gathering him in her arms. Jake clung to her, inhaling the familiar scent of her perfume as years of longing and loss poured out of both of them. Elizabeth stepped back, giving mother and son space for their reunion. As she watched them, a complex mix of emotions swirled within her. Joy at having her cousin back warred with guilt over not recognizing him sooner, and anxiety about what this would mean for all their lives going forward. The next few hours passed in a blur of tearful reunions and shocked exclamations as more family members arrived. Jake's father, Robert, stood shell-shocked in the corner of the room, unable to tear his eyes away from the son he'd thought he'd buried. Elizabeth's parents hovered nearby, offering support and fielding calls from other relatives eager for news. As the day wore on, the initial euphoria of Jake's return began to give way to the complicated reality of the situation. A detective arrived to take statements, explaining that Jake's case would need to be officially reopened. There were legal matters to address. Jake had been declared dead, his assets distributed, his very existence erased from official records. Elizabeth watched as Jake's eyes grew more and more overwhelmed, his responses becoming shorter, his body language closing off. She recognized the signs of his impending withdrawal and stepped in. "I think that's enough for today," she said firmly, addressing the room at large. "Jake needs rest, and we all need time to process this. Why don't we reconvene tomorrow?" There were murmurs of protest, but Elizabeth stood her ground. Slowly, reluctantly, the room emptied until only she and Jake remained. "Thank you," Jake said quietly, slumping back against his pillows. It was all becoming too much. Elizabeth perched on the edge of his bed, her hand finding his. "I can only imagine. How are you really doing, Jake?" He let out a bitter laugh. "I have no idea. Part of me is overjoyed to have my memories back, to know who I am. But another part," he trailed off, his gaze distant. "Another part wishes you could go back to not knowing," Elizabeth finished gently. Jake nodded, a look of shame crossing his face. "Is that terrible? To almost prefer the simplicity of not knowing, even with all the hardships?" Elizabeth squeezed his hand. "It's not terrible. It's human. You've been through a trauma most people can't even imagine. It's okay to feel overwhelmed." They sat in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Jake spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can be who they want me to be," he admitted. "The Jake they remember, he's gone. I'm not that person anymore." Elizabeth felt her heart break for him. "You don't have to be," she said firmly. "You get to decide who you are now, Jake. We'll all just have to adjust." Jake met her gaze, a glimmer of his old mischievous spark in his eyes. "Even you, Lizzie Bear." The childhood nickname startled a laugh out of Elizabeth. "Especially me," she grinned, feeling some of the tension ease between them. As the days passed, Jake grew stronger physically, but the emotional toll of his return weighed heavily on everyone. Family dynamics, long settled into patterns shaped by grief and loss, were thrown into chaos. Robert Montgomery, never the most emotionally available father, struggled to connect with the son he'd mourned and idealized for a decade. Margaret's overprotectiveness threatened to smother Jake, who had grown used to fending for himself. Elizabeth found herself acting as a buffer, mediating conflicts and offering Jake a refuge from the constant pressure of family expectations. They spent hours talking, Jake sharing snippets of his life on the streets while Elizabeth filled him in on the years he'd missed. One evening, about a week after Jake's release from the hospital, they sat on the deck of the mountain house, watching the sun set over the Rockies. Jake had been quieter than usual all day, a faraway look in his eyes. "Penny for your thoughts?" Elizabeth prompted gently. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood. "I've been thinking about what comes next," he said. "Everyone seems to have these expectations. Dad wants me to join the company, Mom wants me to move back home, but none of it feels right." Elizabeth nodded, understanding all too well the weight of family expectations. "What do you want, Jake?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the darkening sky. I want to help people," he said finally. "Being on the streets, I saw so much suffering, so many people who'd fallen through the cracks. I want to do something about that." A spark of excitement lit up Elizabeth's eyes. "You know, I've been thinking along similar lines," she admitted. "Ever since I found you on that road, I haven't been able to stop thinking about how many others are out there needing help." Jake turned to her, a glimmer of hope in his expression. "Yeah?" Elizabeth nodded, her mind racing with possibilities. What if we started a foundation, something to help people who are homeless or at risk of becoming homeless? We could provide shelter, job training, mental health support, and addiction services," Jake added, his voice growing more animated. "So many people I met on the streets were there because of addiction. If they'd had support earlier." As they talked, the outline of a plan began to take shape. Elizabeth's business acumen combined with Jake's first-hand experience could create something truly impactful. For the first time since his return, Jake felt a sense of purpose, a direction for his new life. "We could really do this, couldn't we?" he said, a hint of his old confidence returning. Elizabeth grinned, feeling more alive than she had in years. We absolutely could. The Montgomery Foundation for Second Chances. What do you think? Jake laughed, the sound warm and genuine. I think it's perfect. A second chance for me and a chance to give others the same opportunity. As night fell over the mountains, Elizabeth and Jake continued to plan, their excitement building with each new idea. Neither of them noticed Margaret watching from the shadows of the living room, her expression a mix of pride and fear, as she realized that the son she'd just gotten back was already slipping away from her again. The next morning, Elizabeth and Jake called a family meeting. The atmosphere was tense as they explained their idea for the foundation and their decision to work together to make it a reality. Robert's face darkened with disappointment. Son, I understand you've been through a lot, but throwing away your future on some pipe dream— It's not a pipe dream, Dad, Jake interrupted, his voice firm. This is important work that needs to be done, and it's what I choose to do with my life. Margaret wrung her hands, tears in her eyes. But you've only just come back to us, Jake. How can you think of leaving again? Elizabeth stepped in, her tone gentle but resolute. Aunt Margaret, Jake's not leaving. He's finding his place in the world, on his own terms. Isn't that what we all want for our children? A heavy silence fell over the room. Finally, Elizabeth's father spoke up. I think it's a wonderful idea, he said, smiling at his daughter and nephew. The Montgomery name has always stood for success. Why shouldn't it also stand for compassion and second chances? Slowly, reluctantly, the rest of the family came around. There were conditions, of course. Jake would need to undergo therapy to deal with his trauma, and Elizabeth would maintain her role at Montgomery Enterprises while getting the foundation off the ground. But by the end of the day, a tentative peace had been reached. As the sun set on another Colorado evening, Elizabeth and Jake stood side by side on the deck, looking out over the valley that had been their childhood playground. Are you ready for this? Elizabeth asked, a hint of nervousness in her voice. It's going to be a lot of work, a lot of scrutiny. Jake turned to her, his eyes clear and determined. I'm ready. For the first time in as long as I can remember, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Elizabeth smiled, linking her arm through his. Me too, cousin, me too. As they stood there, the last light fading from the sky, both Elizabeth and Jake felt the weight of the past lifting. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles they couldn't yet imagine, but they would face it together, two lost souls who had found not just each other, but a shared purpose that would change countless lives, including their own. The decision was made. The Montgomery Foundation for Second Chances would become their legacy, a testament to the transformative power of compassion, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds of family. As night fell over the Rockies, a new chapter began, not just for Jake and Elizabeth, but for all those whose lives they would touch in the years to come. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the polished mahogany conference table in the Montgomery Enterprises boardroom. Jake Montgomery sat rigid in his chair, his borrowed suit feeling like a costume he'd been forced to wear. Across from him, Elizabeth flipped through a stack of papers, her brow furrowed in concentration. Are you sure about this, Lizzie? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe we should wait, give it more time. Elizabeth looked up, her expression softening as she met her cousin's anxious gaze. Jake, we've been planning this for weeks. The foundation needs funding to get off the ground, and the board needs to approve it. We can do this. Jake nodded, trying to quell the churning in his stomach. In the 2 months since his return, he'd made progress, therapy sessions, family dinners, even a few public appearances. But this, presenting their foundation proposal to the Montgomery Enterprises board, felt like a monumental step. As board members began to file in, Jake felt the weight of their curious stares. He knew the whispers that followed him, the prodigal son back from the dead, now wanting to use company resources for charity. He straightened his tie, Elizabeth's reassuring smile giving him strength. Good morning, everyone, Robert Montgomery's commanding voice filled the room as he took his seat at the head of the table. I believe my daughter and nephew have a proposal for us today. Elizabeth stood, her poise impeccable as always. Thank you, Father. As you all know, recent events have brought to light some of the challenges faced by those less fortunate in our community. As Elizabeth launched into their carefully prepared presentation, Jake found himself transported back to a memory from his time on the streets. He was huddled under a bridge, sharing a meager meal with an elderly woman named Rose. "People think we're invisible," she'd told him, her roomy eyes filled with a lifetime of pain. "But we see them. We see their fear, their disgust, their relief that they're not us." Jake blinked, focusing back on the present, as Elizabeth concluded her part of the presentation. "And now, I'd like to turn it over to Jake, whose personal experiences have been invaluable in shaping our vision for the Montgomery Foundation for Second Chances." All eyes turned to Jake. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm him. Then he remembered Rose and all the others he'd met during his years of homelessness. He stood, his voice shaky at first but growing stronger with each word. "Ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you not just as Jake Montgomery, but as someone who has walked in the shoes of those we aim to help." As Jake shared his story, the struggles, the despair and the glimmers of hope he'd experienced, he saw the board members' expressions change. Skepticism gave way to shock, then to something that looked like understanding. By the time he finished, laying out their plans for shelters, job training programs and mental health support, the room was silent. Robert cleared his throat, his face unreadable. "Thank you, Elizabeth, Jake. The board will need time to discuss this proposal. We'll have an answer for you by the end of the week." As they left the boardroom, Elizabeth squeezed Jake's hand. "You were amazing in there," she said softly. "No matter what they decide, I'm proud of you." The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and anticipation. Jake threw himself into research, poring over statistics on homelessness and studying successful intervention programs. Elizabeth balanced her time between her regular duties at Montgomery Enterprises and refining their foundation plans. On Friday afternoon, Robert called them into his office. Jake's heart pounded as they took their seats across from his uncle's imposing desk. Robert's expression was grave as he looked at them. "The board has reached a decision," he said, pausing for what felt like an eternity. "They've agreed to provide initial funding for the Montgomery Foundation for Second Chances, with the stipulation that both of you remain actively involved in its management." Elizabeth let out a delighted gasp while Jake sat in stunned silence. Robert continued, his tone softening slightly. "I want you both to know that I'm proud of what you're trying to accomplish here. It won't be easy, but if anyone can make this work, it's you two." As they left Robert's office, the reality of what they'd achieved began to sink in. They had the green light, the funding, the support. Now came the hard part, turning their vision into reality. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Jake and Elizabeth threw themselves into the work of setting up the foundation, navigating the complex world of non-profit regulations, hiring staff, and scouting locations for their first shelter. For Jake, each step forward in establishing the foundation was accompanied by personal challenges. The more he immersed himself in the world of business and philanthropy, the more he struggled to reconcile it with his experiences on the streets. One afternoon, as they toured a potential site for their first shelter, Jake found himself overwhelmed by memories. The abandoned warehouse, with its graffitied walls and broken windows, was eerily similar to places he'd sought refuge during his darkest days. "Jake?" Elizabeth's voice broke through his reverie. "Are you okay?" He blinked, realizing he'd been standing motionless, staring at a corner where a makeshift bed of cardboard and newspapers lay. "Yeah, I've been in places like this before. On the other side." Elizabeth's expression softened with understanding. She'd learned to recognize these moments when Jake's past and present collided. "Do you want to talk about it?" Jake took a deep breath, running his hand along the rough brick wall. "It's strange," he said quietly. "Part of me looks at this place and sees potential, what it could become, how it could help people. But another part of me is right back there, feeling that desperation, that hopelessness." Elizabeth moved closer, her hand finding his in a gesture of support. "Maybe that's what makes you the perfect person to lead this project, Jake. You understand both sides in a way no one else can." Jake nodded, squeezing her hand gratefully. "You're right. It's just, sometimes it feels like I'm living two lives. Jake Montgomery, the prodigal son and budding philanthropist, and Jack, the homeless guy who's seen the worst of humanity. You're both," Elizabeth said firmly. "And that's what makes you unique, what gives our foundation its heart. We're not just throwing money at a problem, we're approaching it with real understanding." As they continued their tour, Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose. Yes, the memories were painful, but they were also fuel for the fire of change he and Elizabeth were trying to ignite. While Jake grappled with integrating his past and present, Elizabeth faced her own challenges. The more involved she became with the foundation, the more she questioned the values and priorities that had driven her for so long. One evening, as they worked late in the foundation's temporary office, Elizabeth found herself staring at a framed magazine cover on the wall, her own face smiling back at her under the headline, 30 Under 30, The Future of Business. "What's on your mind, Lizzie?" Jake asked, noticing her distraction. Elizabeth sighed, gesturing at the cover. "I used to think this was everything, being successful, being recognized. But now I'm not so sure." Jake moved to stand beside her, studying the image. "Having second thoughts about the foundation?" "No, not at all," Elizabeth said quickly. "If anything, I'm more committed than ever. It's just, I'm realizing how empty a lot of my achievements feel compared to what we're doing now." Jake nodded, understanding all too well the feeling of re-evaluating one's life. "It's okay to be proud of what you've accomplished, Lizzie. Those skills, that drive, they're what's making this foundation possible." Elizabeth turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I know. It's just, I keep thinking about that night I found you on the road. How close I came to just driving by. What kind of person does that make me?" "It makes you human," Jake said gently. "What matters is that you didn't drive by. You stopped, you helped, and now you're dedicating yourself to helping others. That's growth, Lizzie. That's becoming a better version of yourself." As Elizabeth wiped away a stray tear, Jake pulled her into a hug. They stood there for a moment, two people who had found unexpected purpose in each other's struggles. The challenges of reintegrating Jake into society extended beyond the professional realm. Family dynamics, long settled into patterns shaped by his absence, were thrown into turmoil by his return. Sunday dinners at the Montgomery mansion became a weekly exercise in navigating emotional minefields. Jake's parents, still grappling with the miracle of his return, oscillated between overprotectiveness and unrealistic expectations. One such dinner took a tense turn when Margaret brought up the subject of Jake's living situation. "Darling, don't you think it's time you move back home? That apartment downtown is so impersonal." Jake set down his fork, taking a deep breath. "Mom, we've talked about this. I need my own space. I'm not a teenager anymore." Robert chimed in, his tone gruff. "Your mother's right, son. You've been through a trauma. You shouldn't be alone." "I'm not alone," Jake insisted, frustration creeping into his voice. "I have my therapy, my work with the foundation. I'm building a life." Elizabeth watched the exchange with growing concern. She could see Jake's jaw clenching, his posture becoming more defensive. Before things could escalate further, she intervened. "Aunt Margaret, Uncle Robert," she said, keeping her voice calm. "I know you're worried about Jake. We all are. But part of his recovery is regaining his independence. The Jake who came back to us isn't the same boy who left. We need to give him space to figure out who he is now." A heavy silence fell over the table. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice trembling slightly. "We just got you back, Jake. We're terrified of losing you again." Jake's expression softened. He reached across the table, taking his mother's hand. "You're not going to lose me, Mom. I'm here, I'm staying. But I need you to trust me, to know what I need." As the tension slowly dissipated, Elizabeth caught Jake's eye, offering a supportive smile. These family dinners might be challenging, but they were also opportunities for healing, for rebuilding bonds strained by years of absence and grief. As summer faded into autumn, the Montgomery Foundation for Second Chances began to take shape. The warehouse they toured months earlier was now undergoing renovations, transforming into a multi-purpose facility that would offer shelter, job training, and support services. Jake and Elizabeth threw themselves into every aspect of the project, from fundraising galas to hands-on volunteer work. Their different backgrounds and experiences proved to be a powerful combination, allowing them to approach problems from multiple angles. One crisp October morning, they stood together on the roof of the nearly completed shelter, surveying the city sprawled out before them. Jake took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs. "I used to come to places like this," he said quietly. "Abandoned buildings, construction sites, anywhere to get off the streets, to feel safe for a moment." Elizabeth leaned against his shoulder, offering silent support. She'd learned that sometimes the best thing she could do was simply listen. Jake continued, his voice distant, as if lost in memory. "There was this one place, an old factory on the outskirts of town. A group of us would gather there on cold nights. We'd share whatever food we'd managed to scrounge up, tell stories, try to forget how hard things were for a while. He turned to Elizabeth, his eyes shining with unshed tears. I keep thinking about them, Lizzie. All the people I met out there, I got a second chance, but what about them? Elizabeth squeezed his hand. That's why we're doing this, Jake. We can't help everyone, but we can make a difference. One person at a time. As they stood there looking out over the city they hoped to change, a commotion from the street below caught their attention. A small group of protesters had gathered, carrying signs with slogans like "No shelter in our neighborhood" and "Protect our property values." Jake's face fell as he read the signs. I knew we'd face opposition, but seeing it, Elizabeth straightened her shoulders, a determined glint in her eye. Then we'll just have to show them why this matters. Come on, let's go talk to them. As they made their way down to the street, Jake felt a familiar anxiety creeping in. He'd faced hostility on the streets, but this was different. These weren't people lashing out from their own pain. These were people actively trying to stop their work. Elizabeth approached the group first, her voice calm and steady. Good morning. I'm Elizabeth Montgomery, and this is my cousin Jake. We're the founders of the Montgomery Foundation. Can we talk about your concerns? A middle-aged man stepped forward, his expression skeptical. Look, we're not against helping people, but a homeless shelter? Here? It'll bring crime, drugs. Our children won't be safe. Jake felt a surge of anger at the man's words, but he forced himself to remain calm. Sir, I understand your fears, but I've been where the people we're trying to help are. They're not criminals or addicts. They're people who've fallen on hard times who need a chance to get back on their feet. For the next hour, Jake and Elizabeth engaged with the protesters, listening to their concerns and explaining their vision for the shelter. Jake shared his own story, watching as suspicion gave way to surprise and, in some cases, understanding. By the time they finished, the mood had shifted. While not everyone was fully convinced, the outright hostility had faded. One woman even approached Jake, her eyes filled with tears. My brother, she said softly. He's been on the streets for years. We've tried to help, but maybe a place like this is what he needs. As the protesters dispersed, some still grumbling but others looking thoughtful, Jake and Elizabeth shared a weary but triumphant smile. It was a small victory, but an important one. That was incredible, Jake, Elizabeth said as they walked back into the building. The way you connected with them made them see the human side of what we're doing. Jake shrugged, but there was a new confidence in his posture. It's like you said, Lizzie. My experiences, as painful as they were, give us an edge. We're not just talking about statistics. We're talking about real people. As they reached their office, Elizabeth's phone buzzed with a news alert. Her face paled as she read the headline. Jake, she said, her voice tight, we have a problem. She held out the phone, and Jake felt his stomach drop as he read, Montgomery airs criminal past exposed. Questions raised about new foundation's leadership. The article detailed a series of petty crimes Jake had committed during his time on the streets. Shoplifting, trespassing, things he'd done to survive but had never been caught for. Someone had connected the dots, and now their fledgling foundation was facing its first major crisis. Jake sank into a chair, his mind reeling. All the progress they'd made, all the trust they'd built, would it all come crashing down because of his past? Elizabeth knelt beside him, her expression fierce. We'll get through this, Jake, together. This doesn't change who you are or what we're trying to accomplish. As they sat there, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room, Jake and Elizabeth faced the stark reality of the challenge before them. Their foundation, born from personal tragedy and driven by a shared vision of hope, now faced its greatest test. The road ahead would be difficult, but as Jake met Elizabeth's determined gaze, he felt a surge of resolve. They had come too far, overcome too much to let this derail their dreams. Whatever came next, they would face it, as they had faced everything else, together, with courage and an unwavering commitment to second chances. The sound of Elizabeth's phone ringing broke the tense silence. As she answered, her expression shifting from concern to surprise, Jake realized that their journey was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The Montgomery Foundation's headquarters buzzed with frantic energy as Elizabeth paced the length of the conference room, her heels clicking a staccato rhythm on the polished floor. Jake sat hunched over his laptop, scrolling through an endless stream of news articles and social media posts, each one seeming to twist the knife deeper. Homeless criminal to head charity, Montgomery Foundation's shady past, Jake read aloud, his voice bitter. They're tearing us apart, Lizzie. Elizabeth paused her pacing, her face a mask of determination. We knew there would be challenges, Jake. We just need to face this head on. The door burst open, and Sarah, Elizabeth's longtime assistant, rushed in. I've got our PR team on standby, and legal is reviewing our options, but there's something else. Elizabeth and Jake exchanged worried glances. What is it, Sarah? Elizabeth asked. Sarah hesitated, then said, Your father's calling an emergency board meeting. There's talk of suspending foundation operations pending a full investigation. The news hit like a physical blow. Jake slumped in his chair, while Elizabeth gripped the back of hers so tightly her knuckles turned white. When? Elizabeth managed to ask. Tomorrow morning, Sarah replied. 9 a.m. sharp. As Sarah left to make more calls, Jake stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city below. Maybe I should step down, he said quietly. The foundation is more important than me. If I'm the problem— Don't you dare, Elizabeth interrupted, her voice fierce. She crossed the room, grabbing Jake by the shoulders and forcing him to face her. You are not the problem, Jake. You're the heart of this foundation. Everything we're doing is because of your experiences, your insight. We're not giving up. Jake met her gaze, seeing the fire in her eyes. Slowly, he nodded. Okay, he said. So what's our plan? For the next several hours, Elizabeth and Jake worked tirelessly, preparing their defense. They gathered testimonials from people they'd helped, compiled statistics on the positive impact they'd already made, and crafted a statement addressing Jake's past head-on. As night fell, they found themselves alone in the office, the rest of the staff having gone home hours ago. Elizabeth rubbed her tired eyes, looking over at Jake, who was still typing furiously. Jake, she said softly, we should get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. He nodded absently, not looking up from his screen. You go ahead. I just want to finish this. Elizabeth hesitated, then walked over to him. Gently, she closed his laptop. Jake, look at me. He did, and she saw the fear and uncertainty in his eyes. What if it's not enough? He whispered. What if they shut us down? Elizabeth took his hands in hers. Then we'll start over. We'll find another way. But right now you need to sleep, we both do. As they gathered their things to leave, Elizabeth's phone rang. She frowned at the unfamiliar number but answered. Hello? Is this Elizabeth Montgomery? A gruff voice asked. Yes, who's this? My name's Frank. I knew Jake from the streets. Elizabeth's eyes widened. She put the phone on speaker, motioning for Jake to listen. I saw the news, Frank continued, about Jake's past and all. I just wanted to say, he saved my life, back when we were both out there. I was ready to give up and he gave me hope, showed me kindness, when no one else would. Jake's breath caught, tears welling in his eyes, as he recognized the voice of an old friend he'd thought he'd never hear from again. Frank, Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm so glad you're okay. There was a pause. Then Frank's voice came back, choked with emotion. Jake? Man, it's really you. Listen, I told the reporter who contacted me to shove it. I won't let them drag you down. You're doing good work. Don't let them stop you. After the call ended, Jake and Elizabeth sat in stunned silence. Finally, Elizabeth spoke. That's it. That's our answer. Jake looked at her, confused. What do you mean? We need to show the board, show everyone, the real impact you've had. Not just since the foundation started, but during your time on the streets. You helped people even when you had nothing yourself. That's the story we need to tell. With renewed energy, they set to work, reaching out to more of Jake's old acquaintances from his homeless days. As the night wore on, a new narrative began to emerge, one of resilience, compassion, and the power of human connection. The next morning, Elizabeth and Jake stood outside the Montgomery Enterprises boardroom, both looking tired but determined. Elizabeth reached out and straightened Jake's tie. Ready? She asked. Jake took a deep breath and nodded. As I'll ever be. They entered the room to find it packed. The board members sat around the large table, their faces a mix of concern and skepticism. Robert Montgomery sat at the head, his expression unreadable. In the back, a small group of reporters huddled, eager for any tidbit of information. Robert called the meeting to order, his voice grave. We're here to discuss the recent allegations concerning Jake Montgomery's past and its potential impact on the Montgomery Foundation. Elizabeth, Jake, you have the floor. Elizabeth stepped forward, her posture confident despite the butterflies in her stomach. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, members of the press, we stand before you today not to deny the past, but to show you how it has shaped our present and our vision for the future. She launched into their prepared presentation, detailing the Foundation's accomplishments and future plans. As she spoke, Jake watched the faces of the board members, trying to gauge their reactions. Some seemed swayed by the statistics and testimonials, while others remained skeptical. Then it was Jake's turn. He stood, his hands shaking slightly as he faced the room. "Yes, I committed crimes while I was homeless," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I'm not proud of it, but I'm not ashamed either. I did what I had to do to survive, but even in those darkest moments, I never lost sight of my humanity or the humanity of those around me." He went on to share stories of helping fellow homeless individuals find shelters on freezing nights, of sharing what little food he had, of offering comfort to those who'd lost hope. With each anecdote, the mood in the room shifted. As Jake finished speaking, the door at the back of the room opened. A group of people filed in, some well-dressed, others looking a bit rough around the edges. Elizabeth recognized Frank from the phone call, along with several others she'd seen in photos from Jake's time on the streets. Frank stepped forward, his voice gruff but clear. "We're here to speak for Jake. He helped us when no one else would. He's the real deal." One by one, they shared their stories. A woman told of how Jake had defended her from an attacker, risking his own safety. An elderly man recounted how Jake had helped him reconnect with his estranged daughter. Each story painted a picture of a man who, even at his lowest point, had never stopped trying to make a difference. As the last person finished speaking, a heavy silence fell over the room. Robert Montgomery stood, his face a complex mix of emotions. "I think we've heard enough to make a decision," he said. "The board will recess to discuss—" "Wait!" a voice interrupted. All heads turned to see Margaret Montgomery standing in the doorway, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. "I have something to say." She walked to the front of the room, standing between Jake and Elizabeth. "When we lost Jake," she began, her voice wavering, "I thought my world had ended. For years I was lost in grief, but now I see that while we were mourning, Jake was out there, living the values we'd always tried to instill in him: compassion, resilience, the importance of helping others." Margaret turned to face the board. "This foundation isn't just about helping the homeless. It's about recognizing the humanity in everyone, no matter their circumstances. If we turn our backs on Jake now, if we let fear and prejudice guide our decisions, then we're turning our backs on everything the Montgomery name is supposed to stand for." The room erupted in murmurs. Robert looked at his wife, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, he nodded. "I move that we not only continue support for the Montgomery Foundation, but increase its funding," he announced. "All in favor?" Hands rose around the table, some quickly, others more hesitantly, but in the end, the vote was unanimous. Elizabeth let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, while Jake stood in stunned silence. As the meeting adjourned, the room filled with the buzz of conversation. Reporters rushed to get statements. Board members congratulated Jake and Elizabeth, and in the midst of it all, the Montgomery family found themselves in a group hug, years of pain and misunderstanding beginning to heal. Later that evening, as the sun set over the city, Jake and Elizabeth stood on the roof of their nearly completed shelter. The crisis had been averted, their vision affirmed, but both knew that the real work was only beginning. "I can't believe we did it," Jake said, shaking his head in wonder. Elizabeth smiled, bumping his shoulder with hers. "I can. We make a pretty good team, cousin." Jake nodded, then turned to face her, his expression serious. "Lizzie, I can't thank you enough. For believing in me, for fighting for this. I don't know where I'd be without you." Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes. "You'd be exactly where you are, Jake. You're the strongest person I know. You survived years on the streets, never losing your compassion. I'm just glad I get to be part of your journey now." As they looked out over the city, the lights coming on as night fell, both felt a sense of possibility they hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead would still be challenging, but they had each other, they had their family, and they had a purpose that went beyond themselves. "So," Jake said, a hint of his old mischievous smile playing on his lips, "what's next?" Elizabeth laughed, linking her arm through his. Well, we have a shelter to open, programs to implement, lives to change. I'd say we've got our work cut out for us. As they turned to head back inside, Jake paused, looking back at the city one last time. You know, he said softly, for the first time since I came back, I feel like I'm truly home. Elizabeth squeezed his arm, understanding the weight of his words. Welcome home, Jake, she said. Now let's go change the world. They walked back into the building, leaving behind the shadows of the past and stepping into a future bright with promise. The Montgomery Foundation for Second Chances was more than just a name now. It was a living, breathing testament to the power of resilience, compassion, and the unbreakable bonds of family. As night settled over the city, the lights of the shelter glowed like a beacon of hope, a promise of better days to come for all those who had ever felt lost or forgotten. And at the heart of it all were Jake and Elizabeth, two souls who had found their purpose in helping others find theirs. The crisis had been more than just a threat to the foundation. It had been a crucible, testing their resolve, their relationships, and their vision. They had emerged stronger, more united and more committed than ever to their mission. In the coming days, there would be interviews to give, programs to finalize, and a grand opening to plan. But for now, as Jake and Elizabeth joined their family for a quiet dinner, there was a sense of peace, of rightness. As they gathered around the table, Robert raised his glass in a toast. To second chances, he said, his voice gruff with emotion, and to the two remarkable people who remind us all of what's truly important. Glasses clinked, smiles were exchanged, and in that moment, surrounded by love and purpose, Jake and Elizabeth knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they were ready to face them, together. The grand opening of the Montgomery Foundation's first shelter was a testament to how far they had come. The renovated warehouse, once a symbol of urban decay, now stood as a beacon of hope in the heart of Denver. Its facade, painted in warm, welcoming colors, bore the foundation's logo, a phoenix rising from ashes, symbolizing rebirth and second chances. Jake stood at the podium, his hands steady, as he addressed the crowd gathered for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. The past 6 months had transformed him, not just physically. He now stood tall in a well-fitted suit, his hair neatly trimmed, but in his demeanor, gone was the haunted look in his eyes, replaced by a quiet confidence and sense of purpose. Today, he began, his voice clear and strong, we're not just opening a building, we're opening doors to new beginnings, to hope, to the possibility of a better tomorrow for those who have been forgotten by society. As Jake spoke, Elizabeth watched from the side, her heart swelling with pride. She caught her father's eye in the crowd, and Robert gave her a subtle nod of approval. The journey to this moment had been fraught with challenges, but it had also healed wounds and bridged gaps that had seemed insurmountable. After the ceremony, as guests toured the facility, Jake found himself approached by a familiar face, Frank, the old friend from his days on the streets who had come to his defense during the crisis. This place is something else, Jake, Frank said, looking around in awe. You really did it. Jake clasped his friend's shoulder. We did it, Frank. Your voice, your story. It made all the difference. How are you doing? The job working out? Frank nodded, a smile spreading across his weathered face. Yeah, the construction gig your foundation set me up with, it's good, steady work. I've even got my own apartment now, small, but it's mine, you know. As they talked, Elizabeth approached, greeting Frank warmly. I'm so glad you could make it, Frank. Your support has meant the world to us. Frank shuffled his feet, looking slightly embarrassed. It was nothing, just telling the truth. Listen, I was wondering, there's this group I've been talking to, other folks trying to get back on their feet. They're good people, just need a chance. I was thinking maybe I could bring them by, show them what you've got going on here. Jake and Elizabeth exchanged a glance, both breaking into wide smiles. Frank, that's exactly what we want, Jake said. This place isn't just for shelter, it's a community. The more people we can reach, the better. As Frank moved on to explore more of the facility, Elizabeth linked her arm through Jake's. You know, she said softly, moments like that make all the late nights and stress worth it. Jake nodded, his eyes scanning the room filled with volunteers, donors, and potential residents. It's really happening, isn't it? We're making a difference. The impact of the Montgomery Foundation extended far beyond the walls of their first shelter. In the months following the opening, Elizabeth and Jake found themselves at the forefront of a growing movement in Denver. Elizabeth, once known primarily as a cutthroat businesswoman, was now a regular fixture at city council meetings and community forums. She leveraged her business acumen and connections to forge partnerships between the private sector and social services, creating job training programs and employment opportunities for the foundation's clients. One crisp autumn morning, Elizabeth stood before the Denver City Council, presenting a proposal for a citywide initiative to combat homelessness. As she spoke, her passion evident in every word, she caught sight of her father sitting in the back of the chamber. Robert Montgomery listened intently, a look of pride on his face that Elizabeth had spent years chasing, but had never quite achieved, until now. The Montgomery Foundation has proven that with the right support, individuals can overcome homelessness and become productive members of our community, Elizabeth concluded. This initiative will expand that model across the city, creating a network of support that will lift up our most vulnerable citizens and, in turn, strengthen our entire community. As applause filled the chamber, Elizabeth felt a sense of fulfillment that no business deal had ever provided. She was no longer just accumulating wealth. She was using it to create lasting, meaningful change. Jake, meanwhile, had become the heart and soul of the foundation's day-to-day operations. His experiences on the streets gave him a unique ability to connect with those the foundation served, to understand their struggles and fears in a way no amount of training could provide. On a blustery winter evening, Jake led a group of volunteers on one of the foundation's regular outreach missions. They moved through the city's hidden corners, offering warm meals, clothing, and information about the foundation's services. As they approached a small encampment beneath an overpass, Jake recognized a familiar figure huddled against the concrete pillar. "Mike," he called out softly. The man looked up, his eyes widening in recognition. "Jack? Jake, right? I heard you got out, but I didn't believe it." Jake knelt beside his old acquaintance, noting the signs of illness and exhaustion etched on Mike's face. "I did, Mike, and I want to help you do the same. Will you let us?" Mike hesitated, years of distrust and disappointment evident in his wary gaze. But as Jake continued to talk, explaining the foundation's programs and sharing his own journey, a flicker of hope ignited in Mike's eyes. By the end of the night, Mike and several others from the encampment had agreed to come to the shelter. As they boarded the foundation's van, Jake felt a profound sense of coming full circle. He had once been where these men and women were, and now he was able to offer them the lifeline he had so desperately needed. The foundation's success began to attract national attention. News outlets ran features on the Montgomery Miracle, highlighting the unique approach that combined Jake's street-level insights with Elizabeth's business savvy. One sunny spring morning, Jake and Elizabeth found themselves in a green room at a major news network, preparing for a live interview. As makeup artists fussed over them, Elizabeth noticed Jake's hands shaking slightly. "Nervous?" she asked, reaching out to squeeze his arm. Jake gave a rueful smile. "A little. It's still strange sometimes, being on this side of things." Elizabeth nodded, understanding. "You're doing great, Jake. Just remember, every time we share our story, we're reaching more people who need help or who might be inspired to help others." As they settled into their seats on the set, the interviewer, a well-known anchor, turned to them with a warm smile. "Elizabeth, Jake, thank you for joining us. Your foundation has been making waves in Denver. Can you tell us what inspired this venture?" Jake and Elizabeth exchanged a glance, years of shared history passing between them in an instant. Elizabeth nodded slightly, encouraging Jake to take the lead. "It all started with a chance encounter on a snowy road," Jake began, his voice steady as he recounted the night Elizabeth had found him. As he spoke, weaving their personal story with the mission of the foundation, the studio crew leaned in, captivated. When the interview ended, the anchor shook their hands warmly. "That was incredible," she said off camera. "You two have something special here. Have you considered expanding to other cities?" The question caught them both off guard. They had been so focused on Denver, on proving their model could work, that they hadn't seriously considered expansion. But as they left the studio, the idea took root. Elizabeth mused as they walked to their car, she might be onto something. The need isn't limited to Denver. If our model works here, why couldn't it work elsewhere? Jake nodded slowly, his mind racing with possibilities. It would be a big step. We'd need to be careful not to lose our personal touch, the things that make our approach unique. "Agreed," Elizabeth said. But think of the impact we could have. We could create a network of foundations, all working together, sharing resources and knowledge. As they drove back to the foundation headquarters, the conversation flowed, ideas building upon ideas. By the time they arrived, the seed of a larger vision had begun to sprout. The next few months saw Jake and Elizabeth dividing their time between running the Denver operation and exploring the possibility of expansion. They traveled to other cities, meeting with local leaders and visiting existing shelters and outreach programs. During a trip to Seattle, as they toured a rundown shelter in desperate need of resources, Jake felt a tug on his sleeve. He turned to find a young woman, no more than 20, looking up at him with a mixture of hope and desperation. "Are you really going to help?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because we've heard promises before, but nothing ever changes." Jake knelt down to meet her eyes, his voice gentle but firm. "We're going to try our very best. Change isn't easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. But if you're willing to work with us to be part of the solution, we'll be here every step of the way." The young woman studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Okay," she said, "I'll hold you to that." As they left the shelter, Elizabeth could see the weight of responsibility settling on Jake's shoulders. "You okay?" she asked. Jake was quiet for a moment, then said, "You know, when we started this, I thought we were just going to help people get off the streets. But it's so much more than that. We're giving people back their dignity, their sense of worth. That's huge." Elizabeth nodded, understanding completely. "It is huge, and it's why we have to get this expansion right. We're not just growing a business, we're scaling hope." As summer turned to fall, the Montgomery Foundation celebrated its first anniversary with the announcement of its expansion plans. The gala event, held in the grand ballroom of Denver's most prestigious hotel, was a far cry from the humble beginnings of their first shelter. Jake stood at the podium, looking out over a sea of faces, donors, volunteers, success stories from the Foundation's programs, and even a few celebrities who had lent their support to the cause. He felt a moment of vertigo, the surreal nature of his journey hitting him anew. A year ago, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the room, "I stood before a much smaller crowd and promised that we would make a difference. Today, I'm proud to say that we've kept that promise. But we're not done, not even close." He went on to outline their plans for the future: new shelters in Seattle and Chicago, partnerships with local organizations across the country, and a national awareness campaign to change the conversation around homelessness. As Jake spoke, Elizabeth watched from her seat, marveling at the man her cousin had become. Gone was the broken, desperate soul she'd found on that snowy road. In his place stood a leader, a visionary who had taken his pain and transformed it into a force for good. When Jake finished his speech to thunderous applause, Elizabeth joined him on stage for the official announcement. As camera flashes popped and reporters called out questions, she felt a surge of pride and purpose unlike anything she'd experienced in her previous life as a corporate executive. Later that night, as the last of the guests departed, Jake and Elizabeth found themselves alone in the ballroom. They kicked off their shoes, loosened their ties, and sat on the edge of the stage, legs dangling like kids at a school assembly. "Can you believe it?" Elizabeth asked, gesturing at the room around them. "A year ago, this was just an idea, a hope. Now look at us." Jake nodded, a mix of emotions playing across his face. "It's incredible. But you know what I keep thinking about? That first night at the shelter, when we opened the doors and weren't sure if anyone would come. Remember?" Elizabeth smiled at the memory. They had stood in the entrance, hearts pounding, as the first hesitant faces appeared in the doorway. "I remember. We had no idea what we were doing, did we?" "Not a clue," Jake agreed with a chuckle. "But we figured it out, together." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Elizabeth spoke. "Jake, I need to tell you something. I've been offered a position on the city's Homeless Advisory Board. It would mean stepping back from some of my duties at the foundation." Jake turned to her, surprised. "Lizzie, that's fantastic. You'd be able to influence policy, make changes at a systemic level." Elizabeth nodded, but her expression was hesitant. "I know, and that's why I'm considering it. But the foundation, it's our baby. I don't want to abandon you." Jake took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Hey, you could never abandon me, or the foundation. This is an opportunity to expand our impact. You should take it." Elizabeth searched his face, seeing nothing but sincerity and support. "You're sure?" Absolutely, Jake affirmed. Besides, someone needs to keep an eye on City Hall, make sure they don't forget about the people we're trying to help. Who better than you? Elizabeth felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Thank you, Jake. You know, when I found you that night, I thought I was saving you. But the truth is, you saved me too. You gave me purpose, showed me what really matters. Jake's eyes misted over. We saved each other, Lizzie. And now we're trying to save as many others as we can. As they sat there, the enormity of their journey, both personal and professional, settled over them. They had faced their demons, confronted painful truths, and emerged stronger for it. The Montgomery Foundation was more than just a charity. It was a testament to the power of second chances and the unbreakable bonds of family. The next morning, as dawn broke over Denver, Jake stood on the roof of the shelter, watching the city come to life. In the distance, he could see the skyline of the business district where he'd once felt so lost and alone. Now, it was just another part of the city he was working to transform. Elizabeth joined him, handing him a cup of coffee. Big day today, she said. The Seattle team arrives this afternoon to start their training. Jake nodded, taking a sip of the hot brew. You know, I was thinking, maybe I should go to Seattle for a while, help get things set up there. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. You sure that's a big move? I'm sure, Jake said, his voice confident. We need to make sure the new locations stay true to our vision. Who better to make that happen than me? Elizabeth smiled, recognizing the spark of excitement in her cousin's eyes. Look at you, ready to conquer new cities. Just don't forget about us little people back in Denver. Jake laughed, throwing an arm around her shoulders. As if I could ever forget where I came from. This city, this foundation, it's all part of me now. No matter where I go, I'll always come back home. As the sun rose higher, bathing the city in golden light, Jake and Elizabeth stood together, looking out over the world they were working to change. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with new obstacles and unexpected turns, but they were ready to face whatever came their way, armed with the strength of their convictions and the power of their shared purpose. The Montgomery Foundation for Second Chances had given new life to countless individuals, but perhaps its greatest achievement was the transformation it had wrought in its founders. Elizabeth Montgomery, once driven solely by profit and prestige, had discovered a deeper, more fulfilling definition of success. And Jake Montgomery, who had once been lost to the world, had found not just himself, but a calling that gave meaning to his struggles. As they turned to head back inside, ready to face another day of changing lives, both Jake and Elizabeth knew that this was just the beginning. The story of the Montgomery Foundation, like the stories of those it sought to help, was one of continual growth, of challenges overcome and of hope renewed with each new dawn. The future stretched out before them, full of possibility and promise. And whatever it might hold, they would face it as they had faced everything else, together with open hearts and a steadfast commitment to the belief that everyone deserves a second chance. 5 years had passed since the Montgomery Foundation for Second Chances opened its doors in Denver. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of change as Elizabeth Montgomery stood at the podium, addressing a crowd gathered for the Foundation's annual gala. When we began this journey, Elizabeth said, her voice carrying across the hushed audience, we had a dream of changing lives. Today, I'm proud to say that dream has become a reality, far beyond what we ever imagined. The ballroom was filled with faces both familiar and new, donors, volunteers, and most importantly, individuals whose lives had been transformed by the Foundation's work. Elizabeth's gaze swept over them, pride swelling in her chest. In 5 years, we've expanded to 15 cities across the country. We've provided shelter to over 10,000 individuals, helped 5,000 secure stable employment, and reunited countless families torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. As Elizabeth continued her speech, detailing the Foundation's achievements and future plans, her eyes landed on a familiar face in the front row. Jake sat there, beaming with pride, looking every inch the confident leader he had become. After the applause died down and the formalities concluded, Elizabeth made her way through the crowd to Jake's side. They embraced warmly, the bond between them stronger than ever. Great speech, Lizzie, Jake said, his eyes twinkling. Though I think you understated our impact a bit. Elizabeth laughed, linking her arm through his as they moved towards a quieter corner of the room. Well, we can't sound too boastful, can we? How are things in Seattle? Jake's face lit up. Incredible. The new youth outreach program is really taking off. We're reaching kids before they end up on the streets, giving them alternatives, support. As they talked, catching up on the details of their lives and work, both marveled at how far they'd come. Elizabeth, once consumed by corporate ambition, now found fulfillment in her role on the National Task Force for Homeless Policy Reform. Jake, who had once been lost and alone, now led teams across the country, his experiences informing every decision and initiative. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Frank, now the Foundation's outreach coordinator in Denver. "Boss lady, boss man," he greeted them with a grin. "Got someone here who wants to say hello?" Behind Frank stood a young woman, her eyes bright with nervous excitement. "Ms. Montgomery, Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm Sarah. Sarah Peters, I was one of the first residents at your Seattle shelter 3 years ago." Jake's face softened with recognition. "Sarah, of course. How are you doing?" Sarah straightened, a proud smile spreading across her face. "I'm great, actually. I just started my second year of college. Social work major. I want to do what you both do. Give people hope." Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes as she listened to Sarah's story of transformation. This, she realized, was the true measure of their success, not in numbers or accolades, but in lives renewed, in hope restored. As the evening wore on, Elizabeth and Jake found themselves on the rooftop terrace, the Denver skyline glittering before them. It was reminiscent of that night years ago when they had first dreamed up the foundation, but so much had changed since then. "Do you ever think about that night?" Jake asked, as if reading her thoughts. "When you found me on the road," Elizabeth nodded, her gaze distant. "All the time I think about how close I came to driving by, how different both our lives would be if I hadn't stopped." Jake was quiet for a moment, then said, "You know, I used to think you saved me that night, but I've realized it's more than that. We saved each other, Lizzie, and now, together, we're saving others." Elizabeth turned to him, seeing not just her cousin but her partner, her best friend, the other half of this incredible journey they'd embarked on. "We are," she agreed, "and we're just getting started." As they stood there, the cool night air wrapping around them, both felt a profound sense of purpose and contentment. The path that had led them here had been fraught with challenges, personal demons, public scrutiny, the daunting task of scaling their vision. But every struggle had only strengthened their resolve, deepened their understanding of the work they were meant to do. In the distance they could see the lights of the downtown shelter, their first, the one that had started it all. Now it was just one of many, a node in a network of hope spreading across the country, but it would always hold a special place in their hearts, a reminder of where they'd begun and how far they'd come. "You know," Jake said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I had a dream last night. I was back on the streets, cold and alone, but then I saw this light, and when I walked towards it, I found myself here, at the foundation, and I realized, even in my dreams, I know I'm not alone anymore." Elizabeth squeezed his hand, understanding the weight of his words. "You'll never be alone again, Jake. Neither of us will." As they turned to rejoin the gala, a shooting star streaked across the sky. They paused, watching its bright arc. "Make a wish," Elizabeth said softly. Jake shook his head, a contented smile on his face. "No need. Everything I could wish for, we're already working towards. One second chance at a time." They walked back inside, leaving the quiet of the night for the warmth and energy of the gathering. As they moved through the crowd, greeting donors, volunteers, and program participants, the impact of their work was palpable. Each smile, each story of transformation, each expression of gratitude reinforced the power of their mission. The Montgomery Foundation for Second Chances had become more than just an organization. It was a movement, a beacon of hope in a world that often seemed dark and unforgiving. And at its heart were Elizabeth and Jake, two individuals who had found their purpose in helping others find theirs. As the night drew to a close, Elizabeth and Jake stood once more at the podium, this time together. The room fell silent, all eyes on the duo who had started this remarkable journey. 5 years ago, Jake began, his voice strong and clear, "I was lost, without hope, without a future. Today I stand before you not just as a man who found his way home, but as someone dedicated to helping others do the same." Elizabeth picked up where he left off, her words flowing seamlessly with his. The Montgomery Foundation isn't just about providing shelter or jobs. It's about restoring dignity, rebuilding lives, and most importantly, it's about second chances. Because we believe that everyone, no matter their circumstances, deserves the opportunity to rewrite their story. As they finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. But for Elizabeth and Jake, the most powerful moment came after. As they looked out over the sea of faces, each one a testament to the change they'd set in motion. In that moment, surrounded by the tangible results of their dream, they knew with absolute certainty that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would have its challenges, but they were ready to face them, armed with the strength of their convictions and the power of compassion. As the last guest departed and the cleanup began, Elizabeth and Jake found themselves once more on the rooftop terrace. The city was quieter now, the late-night calm settling over Denver. But in shelters across the city, and now, across the nation, lights still burned, offering sanctuary to those in need. Jake pointed to one such light, barely visible in the distance. "You see that?" he said softly. "That's why we do this. For every light on, there's someone finding hope tonight." Elizabeth nodded, feeling a swell of emotion. "And tomorrow we'll wake up and do it all again, because there's always someone else who needs a second chance." As they stood there, the cool night air wrapping around them, the enormity of their journey, both past and future, settled over them. From a chance encounter on a snowy road to a nationwide movement of hope and transformation, their path had been extraordinary. Yet both knew that the most important steps were always the ones yet to come. The future stretched out before them, full of possibility and promise. And whatever it might hold, they would face it as they had faced everything else, together, with open hearts and an unwavering commitment to the belief that everyone deserves a second chance. As the first light of dawn began to paint the sky, Elizabeth and Jake shared a smile, ready to embrace whatever the new day might bring. For in every sunrise, there was the promise of renewal, of fresh starts and second chances, a promise they had dedicated their lives to fulfilling, one life at a time. If this story resonated with your soul, don't miss out on more heart-touching stories we have to share. Subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and join us as we explore content that could bring new meaning to your journey. Don't wait. The next video is already waiting for you. Click now and continue this journey with us.